Good evening and welcome. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and I'm just here momentarily to welcome you on behalf of the New York Society Library and to welcome tonight's speaker, Matthew F. Delmont. I know that we have a lot of World War II history buffs in our library population. I'm one of them myself, and we have a lot of related books, but Half American adds a new and vast viewpoint to the narrative of the war and the American experience in it. As the New York Times Book Review put it, this vivid book shows how much of World War II looks different when viewed from the perspective of Black Americans, many of whom drew parallels between the fascist threat abroad and Jim Crow at home. Its author, Matthew F. Delmont, thank you for joining us, is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College. He's a Guggenheim Fellow whose other books include Why Busing Failed, Race, Media, and the National Resistance to School Desegregation, and The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, said it well, "I wish Half American had been in my classrooms. It belongs firmly within the canon of indispensable World War II books." I'm delighted to hand over the virtual stage to Professor Delmont.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the nice introduction, and thanks everyone for joining this evening. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to speak virtually with the New York Society Library, and I appreciate everyone supporting the library and their mission. Give me just 1 minute to pull up my slides. Half American was published in October. I've really cherished the opportunity to have a chance to speak about the book with audiences all across the country, and TV interviews, radio interviews, and podcasts. One of the questions I've received is where the book came from. And so I want to start there, tell you a bit about the inspiration for the book before diving into some of the book's main arguments. So the book emerged from my last book project, which was called Black Quotidian. It's a digital book project that was published by Stanford University Press. You could find it for free online at blackquotidian.org. The purpose of this book was to look at historical African-American newspapers to try to get a better understanding of how different communities were covering history as it unfolded. So for each day across the entire year, I would find one historical newspaper article from Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier, and then write a short blog post about it. And so that was the objective of Black Quotidian. In the course of doing the research for that project, I kept coming across images like this. This is from the Minneapolis Spokesman. I'm from Minneapolis myself, so I had to shout out my hometown newspaper. The Minneapolis Spokesman is the longest running Black newspaper in Minneapolis, but it's an example of the kind of images I kept coming across from the war years in these Black newspapers. First, I came across dozens and eventually hundreds of pictures and stories like this, highlighting some of the more than 1 million Black men and women who volunteered or were drafted into the military during World War II. These weren't famous people. These were average Black Americans from Minneapolis, from Chicago, from New York. And I was surprised to see this many examples. Now, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, I've taught about this topic for more than a decade, but I hadn't come across this many examples of average Black Americans and their service in World War II. So coming across newspaper articles like this made me curious. And it was that curiosity that led me on the research project that became Half American. It was about 7 years ago that I started the work that became Half American. The title of the book comes from this quote. It's a letter that James G. Thompson wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier. James G. Thompson was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, and he was writing in December of 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because he knew that he and other Black Americans were about to be drafted into the military. He wrote a letter that had a series of very pressing, pointed questions. He asked, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase really stuck with me. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? It's why I chose Half American as the title for the book. The question Thompson was asking is, what does it mean for Black Americans to be drafted into a military to fight for a country and potentially die for a country that doesn't yet treat them as full citizens? The great historian Stephen Ambrose once said that the great irony of World War II was that you had the world's greatest democracy in the United States fighting against the world's worst racist, Adolf Hitler, with the segregated army. Men and women like James Thompson were living that irony. They recognized at the time that there was hypocrisy for the United States to be fighting for freedom and democracy abroad with the segregated army. The Pittsburgh Courier publishes Thompson's letter and then uses it to launch the Double Victory campaign, which becomes the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. The Double Victory campaign meant that Black Americans were fighting for victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism at home. It's important to understand that wasn't just a clever slogan. It really was the case that Black Americans saw this as a two-front battle. They were absolutely committed to helping to win the war militarily, but they also wanted to make sure that there was actual freedom and democracy in the United States when they came home. So that's why I chose Half American as the title, and it's why Double Victory is so important to understanding this historical time period. So I want to highlight in my presentation tonight 3 of the key arguments that the book makes, 3 of the contributions that I hope the book makes to the broader history of World War II. Because it's important that it's not just about adding an additional Black perspective on the war, but part of what the book argues is that some very fundamental concepts of what the war was about change when we look at it from the Black perspective. The first thing is that we have to start the story before Pearl Harbor, because for Black Americans, World War II truly started before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. One of the places we can look at for evidence of this are Black newspapers. If you looked at a Black newspaper from 1933, 34, 35, you'd see extensive coverage of the rise of fascism in Europe. This is an example from the Norfolk Journal and Guide from April 1933 by sociologist Kelly Miller, making direct connections between the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany and what was going on with the KKK in the US South. Black Americans were among the first to recognize the really serious threat that Hitler and the Nazis posed, because they understood that Hitler was drawing explicitly on American racial policies to help justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so every time a new policy was passed against Jewish people in Europe, the segregation of Jews on train cars, the theft of Jewish property, the violence against Jewish communities, Black newspapers covered it and also drew parallels between that experience, what was going on with Black Americans in the South. These same newspapers covered the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and then they covered the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And so already years before Pearl Harbor, there's extensive coverage of the rise of fascism and a clear sense that fascism isn't something that's only going to be a problem for Europe, that it is a problem already in the United States, and that this is a war that the United States is going to eventually have to take part in. And there were a group of Americans who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War starts in 1936 when General Francisco Franco's forces stage a military coup against the democratically elected government of Spain. There were 3,000 Americans who joined the volunteer effort to fight against fascism in Spain. They were collectively called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Of those 3,000, 80 of them were Black volunteers. And again, this was covered extensively in the Black press. A headline there from the Chicago Defender, August 1936, says that the Second World War has already started because Mussolini and Hitler are aiding Franco's forces in Spain. The great poet and writer Langston Hughes is fascinated that these Black American volunteers have gone to volunteer in Spain. He becomes a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American and travels to Spain to be able to report on these volunteers. The thing that fascinates him is that these are average Black Americans who've never been to Spain. They're going to a country they've never been to before to fight on the front lines in another country's civil war. He wants to report their stories. And so I'd like to highlight some of the people he talks about. He talks about Thaddeus Battle, who was a student at Howard University. He was a pre-med student who paused his studies at Howard to go volunteer in Spain. Battle said that the thing that upset him most was seeing these fascist forces burn books and destroy libraries. His parents have been educators and taught him the importance of libraries, the importance of books, and so it really upset him to see this destruction of knowledge. James Bunny Rucker was a 25-year-old son of a Christian minister from Ohio. Rucker was working in construction just months before he deployed to the Spanish Civil War. He was a truck driver in Spain. He was driving supplies and men to the front lines in Spain. He had airplanes that were crashing just next to him. And so you can just imagine what this would be like. He was leading an ordinary life in Cleveland, and then months later, he's on the front lines in Spain. Hughes told these stories and brought them to Black Americans at home. I should say Rucker and many of these volunteers went on to serve in the U.S. Army during World War II. Rucker had 4 other brothers who served along with him. Hughes also highlighted the one Black woman who served in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Her name was Celeria Key. She was a 23-year-old nurse originally from Akron, Ohio, who did her nurse training at Harlem Hospital. She said she volunteered to go to Spain for a couple of reasons. She was a Catholic, and even though she didn't consider herself particularly political, she thought it was her obligation to help people who were in need. And so when she saw news of the peasants and the everyday people in Spain being bombed, she knew she had to do something to help. She tried to volunteer for the Red Cross, but they wouldn't take her. They said her color made it more trouble than it was worth. because she couldn't volunteer with the Red Cross, she ended up volunteering with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The other reason she decided to go to Spain is that she worked at Harlem Hospital with a number of Jewish doctors, and they told her about some of the atrocities that were happening in Nazi Germany. And that steeled her resolve to do something to fight fascism. When she came back, she went on a speaking tour. So she was talking to people all across the country about how they had to pay attention to what was going on in Spain and more broadly in Germany and in Europe. This is in 1938. And so there's clarity all across the country, all across Black America, that fascism is an issue that's critically important that needs to be addressed. On the home front, there's also a rise of civil rights activism in the years before Pearl Harbor. A. Philip Randolph is one of the most important political leaders in Black America at the time. He threatens to lead a march on Washington of 100,000 Black Americans unless President Roosevelt signs an executive order to have non-discrimination provisions that will impact the defense industries. The reason Randolph does this is that once Roosevelt announces that the United States is going to become the arsenal of democracy, everyone understands what that means. It means jobs. But the problem was Black Americans were going to be locked out of those defense industry jobs. And so Randolph works with civil rights activists all across the country to threaten to lead this march. Through a series of high-stakes negotiations with Roosevelt in the White House in the summer of 1941, Randolph agrees to call off the march in exchange for Roosevelt signing an executive order that, at least on paper, promises to lead to more defense industry jobs for Black Americans. It helps to crack open the door to defense industry jobs for Black Americans during the war. And even more importantly, it helps to demonstrate Black political power. The fact that Randolph can threaten this persuasively, it demonstrates that Black Americans are a political force that needs to be taken seriously. It also provides the blueprint for the March on Washington in 1963. So even though this March on Washington doesn't happen in 1941, it lays the foundation for what becomes the much larger march in 1963. So the first important point is that we have to start the story before Pearl Harbor, because for Black Americans, they already understand World War II happening before Pearl Harbor. The second important point, and this will be the largest section of the presentation, is that we have to take the double victory campaign seriously. It wasn't just a slogan, it was really a two-front battle for Black Americans. And that these threads, the military thread and the home front thread, have to be understood together because they were experienced together, they were lived together for Black Americans. Perhaps the most famous individual Black American to serve in the military during World War II was Doris Miller. So I should say at the outset that the entire US military was racially segregated during the war. And this made no sense for a military that was trying to fight and win a global war. There was no strategic or tactical reason to have a segregated military. They only did it to try to make sure Black Americans understood that they were second-class citizens. All the same, more than 1 million Black Americans served in World War II. In the Army, by and large, they were blocked from combat roles. Most of the work they did was in supply and logistical roles. In the Navy, for the majority of the war, Black Americans could only serve as mess attendants, where they would essentially weigh down and serve white officers. In the Marine Corps, at the start of the war, the Marine Corps doesn't allow any Black Americans to serve. It's not until late 1942 that the first cohort of Marines, the Montford Point Marines, get established. But on the morning of Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller, who's a young mess attendant from Waco, Texas, performs heroically on the USS West Virginia. Even though his job on the ship was to do laundry and to cook and clean, once the bombs started falling, once the attack started, he helped to make a makeshift stretcher to move his captain, who was mortally wounded, to a safer space on the deck. He helped attend to the wounds of fellow sailors aboard the USS West Virginia. And then when his lieutenant orders him to go to one of the ship's anti-aircraft guns, he goes there and starts firing at the Japanese planes, potentially hitting and downing one of them. It's tremendously heroic work. And it's acknowledged at the time. He's awarded the Navy Service Cross for his heroism at Pearl Harbor. Miller's story resonates powerfully with Black Americans because they're saying, if you just give us a chance to perform in combat, look what we can do. They say that torpedoes make no distinction between admirals and messmen, so why should the Navy? They use Miller's story as a way of refuting the military's claims that Black Americans lack the bravery and courage to perform well in combat. And Miller wasn't the only Black mess attendant who was at Pearl Harbor. There were dozens of others, including Julius Ellsbury, who was a young mess attendant on the USS Oklahoma. Ellsbury joined the Navy just after turning 18, and he was just 21 years old on the morning of Pearl Harbor. Like Miller, he helped his shipmates after the attack started, but Ellsbury tragically lost his life on that morning. Ellsbury was the first person from Birmingham, Alabama, either Black or white, to be killed in the war. The local newspaper editor compared Ellsbury to Crispus Attucks, the Black hero who was the first person killed in the American Revolution. And this picture of Ellsbury with his Navy uniform on was hung across Black Birmingham in shops and in homes with the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor." So this is how Black Americans understood the start of the war. They understood that mess attendants were there, and even though they didn't have as bold of a role as they would like, they were still performing heroically when given the opportunity. This is the front page of the Chicago Defender just days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It says, "Awake, white America, the hour is at hand." The editors wrote, "White America must now learn that a Negro in the armed service of his country, in the uniform of his government, must be respected as a defender of democracy." Now, there are many upsetting parts about doing this research, but one of the most troubling ones was the story that's on the bottom of this slide. There were hundreds of Black Americans who went to local recruiting offices after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they waited in line just like white Americans did to try to volunteer for the Army and the Navy. The difference was there were dozens of Black Americans who were turned away just because of the color of their skin. At the time, the Army didn't yet have enough all-Black units to accommodate these Black volunteers, and the Chicago Defender profiled 3 of these young men. They were just left dumbstruck. They were wondering, what does it mean that my own country, my own military, won't accept my patriotism, that they won't accept me into the military just because of the color of my skin? This steeled the resolve of Black Americans to fight for equal access, to be able to participate in the military, and to fight to end racism and discrimination. Here are a couple quotes from Roy Wilkins, who was one of the leaders of the NAACP that really encapsulate what was on the minds of a lot of Black Americans at the time. Wilkins said, "We are fighting for a new world, which shall not only not contain a Hitler, but not Hitlerism." And it's an important distinction that as evil as Hitler was, Wilkins and others understood that it was the larger ideology of Hitlerism or of white supremacy that linked the Nazi regime with white supremacists in the United States. It was that larger ideology that had to be overturned. Wilkins also said, "A really white Navy cannot fight for a free world. A Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world." So it's important to understand that these points were being made by civil rights activists at the time. This isn't just something that historians came back and understood decades later. Black people at the time understood that they were being given a raw deal, that they were being asked to serve for a country that didn't yet treat them as full citizens. Just weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a brutal lynching in Sikeston, Missouri, of a man named Cleo Wright, who was a mill worker, that sent shockwaves across Black America. It led Black Americans to question if this was the kind of democracy that America was trying to teach the world. It prompted civil rights protests in St. Louis and all across the country. And a phrase caught on. So while all Americans were saying, "Remember Pearl Harbor," Black Americans started saying, "Remember Pearl Harbor, but remember Sikeston too." This again was an encapsulation of the Double Victory campaign, because it wasn't enough to win these military battles if lynching, if violence against Black people was still going to be tolerated in the United States. Thurgood Marshall is one of the key figures in the book. He's best known as the first Black Supreme Court justice, but during the war, he was the head of the NAACP's legal division. So part of what emerges once Black Americans make it into the military is that they get sent to these military camps that are largely located in the South. And so there's stories of Black Americans coming from New York, from Chicago, from Detroit, and from other northern and western cities, and being sent to these bases in the South. They would board the trains. When they got to the demarcation point for the South, Washington, D.C., or other cities, they had to move to the Jim Crow section of the cars. When their trains would pull into these small southern towns, they had to pull down the shades on the trains so that white townspeople wouldn't throw rocks at the trains because they were so upset about the idea of Black soldiers being stationed on these bases. On the bases themselves, they encountered violence from white officers and from white enlisted men. They were called racial epithets daily. And when they left base for recreation in the small towns, they were cordoned off into the one block Black section of town. If they stepped even a foot outside of that, they were often beaten and attacked by white sheriffs and white police. Things got so bad that hundreds of these soldiers were writing letters to Thurgood Marshall and to Black newspapers saying that they would feel safer once they deployed to Europe or the Pacific than they felt on these bases in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. They said they felt like they were actually at war here in the United States before the war even started. So on the screen, there are just a couple examples of some of the language that showed up in these letters. Troops frequently described how an array of white police personnel were aligned against them and looked to constantly harass them on buses in small towns and on these bases. They kept using terms like we're being treated like dogs or like slaves. They weren't being treated like men. They were being treated with the respect that the uniform deserved. And then the last quote, which says, "It's odd that the US government would let a small town of a few thousand people rule them like that," was about an incident in Gurdon, Arkansas, where a group of troops who came from Detroit were literally chased out of town. They had to flee for their lives because the white townspeople had formed a mob and were going to attack them. Gurdon, Arkansas was a town of just 2,000 people. This base was federal property. And so one of the points that Black Americans kept making is, if the federal government wanted to do something about this, they could. This is federal property. This shouldn't be something that defaults to the racial prejudices and norms of the South. But the federal government never did that. They went with the policies, the Jim Crow policies, the segregation policies of these small Southern towns. And it was an inversion of political power. It allowed these small Southern towns to essentially dominate and dictate what policies were going to be on federal property. Another one of the key characters in the book is Ella Baker. She's probably best known as the grassroots activist who helped to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the 1960s. But during the war, she was the head of membership and branches for the NAACP, and she was wildly successful. So the numbers on the slide give you a sense of how much the NAACP expanded over the course of the war. It went from being a relatively small organization with a lot of strength in the Northeast to being a truly national organization. And part of what having all of these additional chapters and members meant was more resources. Members paid dues, and dues meant that the NAACP now had money to be able to fight larger, more complex, and longer lasting voting rights cases and school desegregation cases. Part of Baker's big insight was that you didn't have to be a professional class Black American to be a leader. You didn't have to be a doctor, a lawyer, a professor. You could be a sharecropper or a barber, an everyday person. And so she went from town to town, organizing local people, training them how to be leaders, and how to fight for issues that matter to them. She held leadership training workshops all across the country, including one in Atlanta that helped train Rosa Parks. And this is in 1945, so this helps to set the stage for what becomes the much larger civil rights movement in the 1950s. This is one of my favorite sources that I found in the course of doing the research. This is a group of soldiers who were stationed in Normandy a few months after the D-Day invasion, who essentially passed the hat or passed the helmet to raise money for the NAACP and for the Double Victory campaign. They said, "We are making a sacrifice for victory abroad, but it does not ensure us of a victory in our own country. We understand and fully realize that we must fight for the Double V and its principles." They raised and sent a check for $333.89. And I like the preciseness of how much they sent. And you can just picture this. These are soldiers who are literally fighting a war, but who paused to raise the money that they can from their available funds to send back home to fight the other half of that battle at home. So again, this document perfectly encapsulates what the Double Victory campaign was about. It was about winning the battles at D-Day, but also then coming home and at the same time supporting civil rights activism at home. And there were dozens of examples like these. Troops in the African theater in the Pacific raising money to send to support the Double Victory campaign. So D-Day, thinking about the military aspects of the war, was one of the most important turning points within World War II. There were about 1,700 Black Americans who participated in the D-Day invasion, including this group, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. So if you look at pictures of the D-Day invasion and you see these funny kind of silver sausage-shaped things floating above the ships, those were barrage balloons. They were helium-filled balloons that were tethered by long cords to the ships, and they dangled wires that had mines attached to them. So they essentially formed a steel curtain of a defense to make sure that Nazi planes couldn't strafe low to drop bombs on ships as they're crossing the channel. And then once they're on the beaches, to make sure the planes couldn't strafe low to shoot up the troops that were coming ashore. There were Black troops that manned these barrage balloons. And so when you see pictures of the channel crossing and you see the barrage balloons, know that those were Black troops participating in the D-Day invasion. One of the troops in the 320th, named Waverly Woodson, performed heroically on D-Day. He was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he was a medic in the 320th. He was wounded as his landing ship came to shore, but nevertheless, he set up a medical aid station on the beach, and over the next 30 hours, tended to the wounds of more than 200 men. He had to do amputations, he had to transfer blood plasma, he had to patch wounds, he had to rescue men from drowning. Amazing, amazing work. His commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, none of the black troops, including Woodson, during the war received the Medal of Honor. 433 were awarded, none received by black troops during the war. I'll mention later in the presentation some of the black troops who were awarded the Medal of Honor later on. I mentioned earlier that by and large, black troops were not given the opportunity to participate in combat, but that does not mean they didn't help win the war. If you think about the D-Day invasion, D-Day just stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and it was really the weeks and months after that that helped to turn the tide of the war. Black troops were absolutely vital to that next stage of the D-Day invasion because they were the backbone of the Allies' logistical and supply effort. It was black troops who were across the channel in the ports in England who were loading the ships that came across the channel. It was black troops who were unloading those ships, then loading up trucks. And it was black troops who drove those trucks. Highlighted here are black troops who drove on the Red Ball Express. They drove more than 400,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, fuel, to help supply the infantry troops as they moved across France and eventually into Germany. These troops were driving around the clock through darkness on these bumpy, winding roads. Without them, it would have been impossible for the Allies to move as quickly across France and into Germany as they did. It's what made the Allies such a mobile and agile force. Without the Red Ball Express and these other black supply troops, infantry troops couldn't move, shoot, or eat. Almost everything the Allies moved to the front passed through the hands of at least one black American. And so part of the argument the book makes is that World War II wasn't just a battle of strategy and will. It was a battle of supply. And when you understand it from that perspective, you can see clearly that black Americans helped to win the war. And this was understood at the time. Langston Hughes wasn't the only black war correspondent. There were a half dozen others working for other black newspapers. This is Ollie Stewart, who was the black war correspondent for the Baltimore African American. He talked about this miracle of supply. He said, although port battalions and work troops are not generally regarded on par with frontline combat troops, it is a matter of record that no group of soldiers in this theater has done more to make possible Allied victory. They liberate no towns, see no flags, drink no champagne, or kiss happy girls. Yet when things become critical, the first cry of high command is, give us more supplies. And so Stewart really put his finger on something that was crucial to understanding the role that black Americans played in the war. It was the supply effort that helped the Allies win. And this was true on the home front as well. There are more than 1 million black Americans who participated in the defense industries, including 600,000 black women, who were essentially black rosary riveters. Highlighted here are some of the welders who worked at Richmond, California. These were particularly important jobs for black women because these jobs were out of bounds for black women prior to the war. They weren't given the opportunity to participate in factory work in this sort of way. And so the war really opened up possibilities that didn't exist previously for black women in factory work. An example of one of these war workers is Rosa Parks, who worked as a civilian seamstress on Maxwell Air Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And she actually credits her work there as transforming her view on race relations. So by late in the war, the buses at Maxwell had been desegregated. So on base, she could ride wherever she wanted to on the buses. But when she transferred to the city bus, then she had to go to the back of the bus. And she described that experience, being able to sit wherever she wanted to at Maxwell, and then just 1 block later, having to transfer to the city bus and going to the back of the bus, as going from being a first-class citizen at Maxwell to being a second-class citizen in Montgomery. It really opened her eyes into what could be done differently in terms of race relations. She was also upset that her brother Sylvester was a Pacific theater veteran who came home and couldn't find a job and couldn't get a mortgage to buy a house. She said later, I'd always been taught that this was America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. I felt that it should be actual rather than just something that we hear and talk about. So Parks, like many others, saw World War II as a turning point. It helped to change her frame of reference and really encourage her to fight even more strongly for civil rights in the decades after World War II. Within the military, the largest unit of black women was a unit called the 6888 Central Postal Directive Battalion that was under the command of Major Charity Adams. They arrived in England in late 1944, and their job was to distribute mail all across the European theater. This was very complicated work because these units were moving constantly, and a lot of men had common names like Mark Adams or John Smith. So they had to develop systems to be able to make sure the mail got to the intended recipients. And all the troops, both black and white, after the war, talked about how important mail was for morale. These black women helped to accomplish that. So I mentioned earlier that during the war, no medals of honor were awarded to black troops. However, in the 1990s, the military upgraded 7 Distinguished Service Cross recipients to the Medal of Honor. They did a review of these awards and determined that discrimination did play a role in the denial of the Medal of Honor. So I want to highlight 3 of the troops who received the Medal of Honor posthumously. One is Reuben Rivers, who's a 23-year-old tank platoon sergeant from Oklahoma. He fought through combat wounds and led several tank advances against German positions in northeastern France. He fought with the 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers. They fought for 160 days consecutively across 4 major campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge. And so Rivers is a good example of the combat prowess of black troops, that even though black troops weren't given many opportunities to participate in combat, when they did, they performed heroically. If I had to vote for the most interesting soldier to fight in World War II, Edward Allen Carter Jr. would get my vote. He was raised by black missionary parents in India and China, and so he is fluent in Hindi, Mandarin, and German. When he was 15, he left home and joined the Chinese National Army to fight against Japanese incursions in Shanghai. He is one of the volunteers I mentioned earlier who fought in the Spanish Civil War, and this is all before he turned 21. He volunteered for the Army before Pearl Harbor, and you would think with combat experience and language skills, the Army would have a good use for him. Instead, they assigned him to be a cook in a quartermaster unit. And I think that's really indicative of how wasteful segregation was. The Army and the military more broadly didn't take advantage of the manpower or the person power that black Americans could bring to the war. They looked only at color and assigned people to more menial and subservient roles. Nevertheless, Carter was in that role through the majority of the war, until late 1944, when the Army is desperate for more infantry troops. They finally issue a call for volunteers and open that call to black Americans. Carter is one of 5,000 black Americans who volunteer for infantry duty, and actually gives up his rank to do it. He goes from being a staff sergeant back to being a private just for the opportunity to serve in combat. And it's there he performs heroically. He's attached to a provisional infantry division that's linked to General Patton's 12th Armored Division. And as that unit's moving across Germany, about to cross the Rhine River in Speyer, Germany, March of 1945, he's riding on a tank. And so let me read from his commendation that goes along with the Medal of Honor. It says, the tank upon which Carter was riding received bazooka and small arms fire from a large warehouse across a field. Carter volunteered to lead a 3-man patrol to the warehouse. Enemy small arms fire covered the field, killing 1 member of the patrol instantly. This caused Carter to order the other 2 members of the patrol to return to the covered position and cover him with rifle fire, while he proceeded alone to carry out the mission. An enemy machine gun burst wounded Carter 3 times in the left arm as he continued the advance. Disregarding these wounds, Carter continued the advance by crawling until he was 30 yards from his objective. The enemy fire became so heavy, Carter took cover behind a bank and remained there for approximately 2 hours. 8 enemy riflemen approached Carter, apparently to take him prisoner, but Carter killed 6 of the enemy soldiers and captured the remaining 2. Now, I mentioned earlier, Carter was fluent in German, so he interrogates the 2 Germans that he's captured as he's leading them across the field back to his unit, getting valuable intelligence about where the rest of the Nazi troops are stationed. It's a remarkable story. It almost sounds like Hollywood stuff, but it was true. Carter actually did these things. The third and final member I'd like to highlight was Vernon Baker. He was the only one still alive to receive his award in person. He was 77 years old at the time. And initially, when he got the call about the Medal of Honor, he didn't want to attend. He said, I performed this work in the 1940s, 5 decades ago. You should have honored me then, not wait until now. Eventually, he decides that he will go. During the war, Baker was a first lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry. He took out 3 machine gun positions and led a battalion charge through heavy fire enemy minefields to help the Allies capture a German mountain stronghold in Italy. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from Baker. He said, I was an angry young man. We were all angry, but we had a job to do, and we did it. And this is important because for a lot of the military personnel, the white military personnel, they thought it was only the black troops who were disgruntled who were angry. That wasn't true. Even extraordinary soldiers like Baker recognized the discrimination. They recognized the racism they faced, and they were angry about it. Yet, as Baker said, they had a job to do, and they did it. So having worked on this book for 7 years, I can say definitively that you can't tell the story of World War II without talking about Black Americans. And my argument is that America and the Allies couldn't have won World War II without the contributions of Black troops. In the third and final section, I want to talk about the civil rights battles that remained at home once these Black troops returned. So despite all the contributions, all the service, all the patriotism I just described, Black veterans, when they returned to the country, were greeted with hostility. This is a quote from James O. Eastland, senator from Mississippi, from the floor of the Senate in June of 1945, just as the war is ending. He said, "Negro soldiers have disgraced the flag of their country. The Negro race is an inferior race. I'm proud that the purest form of white blood flows in my veins. I know that the white race is a superior race. It has ruled the world, it has given us civilization, it is responsible for all of the progress on earth." Now, if these words are upsetting today, imagine what they sounded like to Black veterans who had risked their lives and seen their buddies killed fighting for a country that didn't yet treat them as full citizens. They were outraged by it. More broadly, Eastland was only in the Senate because of voter discrimination. Mississippi was nearly 50% Black, but less than 2% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote because of decades of intentional discrimination, violence, and intimidation. And so Mississippi, in America more broadly, wasn't a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word in 1945. I think it's sometimes easy today to throw around terms like white supremacy, but this is what it looked like in 1945. For Eastland to have these views and then to be in a position of power to be able to influence policy decisions that would shape racist outcomes in the generations to come, that's what white supremacy looked like at the end of the war. And this is what the Double Victory campaign was about. For Black Americans, the war didn't end in 1945. They came home and kept fighting for civil rights in the United States. They went, as one veteran put it, from fighting in the European theater operations to fighting in the Southern theater operations. It didn't do any good to win these military battles if they didn't have actual freedom and democracy at home. So that's why the Double Victory campaign was so important. That whole generation of Black veterans comes back and starts to fight for civil rights in the United States. And so I'll highlight just a few names here. Medgar Evers was part of the Red Ball Express that I mentioned earlier. He loaded cargo for those truck drivers. He was just 19 years old when his unit landed at Normandy just days after the D-Day invasion. In 1946, on his 21st birthday, he led a group of Black veterans try to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He later said, "I had been on Omaha Beach. All we Black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would." Evers went on to take on increasingly important roles in the NAACP in Mississippi. He helped investigate the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. There are dozens of other people I could highlight here, so I'll mention just 3 more. Hosea Williams worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Williams had been a member of an infantry unit who fought in Italy. He earned a Purple Heart in combat. He was nearly killed when he tried to drink from a white-only water fountain in Savannah, Georgia, after the war. Debbie Johnson Roundtree was in the Women's Army Corps. She used the GI Bill to get a law degree from Howard University Law School and opens a pioneering law firm in Washington, D.C., winning several important civil rights cases in the 1950s and 60s. And Amzie Moore became a leader in the Mississippi voting rights movement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s. There are dozens of other people just like these. The last person I'd like to mention is Robert P. Madison. So one of the sources I drew on for the book were a series of oral history interviews that were conducted by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. One of those interviews was with Robert Madison, who was with an infantry unit who fought in Europe during the war. When he came home, he used the GI Bill to earn architectural degrees from Harvard University and from Case Western University, and then opened up a trailblazing architectural firm in Cleveland, Ohio. He built a number of buildings, including working on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. Late in his life, he was about in his 80s, he described going to a bookstore. He went to the big wall of books on World War II and took down a book that described the war, a big, thick volume. He flipped through it. He said, there was nothing in there about Black soldiers, sailors, Marines, or airmen. And his quote, which stuck with me, he said, "We were a forgotten group of people." I wrote this book for Black veterans like Robert Madison, so they wouldn't be forgotten. So in conclusion, let me say that the stories we tell about the past matter. Stories of World War II that do not reckon with the Black American experience leave us ill-prepared to understand the present and rudderless as we try to navigate the future. Ignorance is a luxury that we cannot afford. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of explicit racism as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history and cultural life, rather than as a surprise or an anomaly. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can see the modern battles over voting rights and racial justice as the continuation of decades-long struggles to make America an actual functioning democracy. And if we tell the right stories about the war, we can finally honor the sacrifices of the Black veterans, defense industry workers, and citizens who fought on foreign battlefields and in their own cities and towns so that no one would ever again be treated as half American. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Delmont, that is fascinating stuff. It's just so interesting, especially, I mean, to hear about people that I think many of us were not familiar with the stories of before, but also the people like Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers, who we probably are familiar with, but not this section of their lives. So good question to start us off with here. To what extent has the U.S. military acknowledged the injustice that you've so compellingly described?
So, to their credit, the U.S. military has gone a long way to acknowledging the kind of discrimination, racism that took place in World War II. Many of the troops and units I've mentioned in the course of the presentation have been given awards or honors. In some cases, there are bases or statues dedicated to them at military training facilities. And so I think the military does deserve credit for acknowledging some of this discrimination. It's also the case that even though the military is segregated when the war ends in 1945, in 1948, with President Truman's executive order, the military begins a process of desegregation. I think that's important, that it really puts the military on a more forward-looking perspective with regards to racial equity, which is not to say that racism doesn't still exist in the present-day military, but I think the military has thought longer and harder about this aspect than a lot of other aspects of our society.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the desegregation of the on paper official desegregation of the armed forces. Was the Black American response, say in newspapers, editorials, conversation at that time, did it seem like a very positive move? Was there a sense of backlash about it?
It was by and large very positive once President Truman signs that executive order in 1948. What I usually tell my students is that executive order was both a decade late and a decade early. It was a decade late because if you think about it, there was no strategic or tactical reason to have a segregated military. It was cumbersome, it was costly, it was resource intensive because they had to do everything in duplicate. They had to have separate latrines, separate barracks. It was literally someone's job to make sure once these troops deployed that everything remained segregated. The Red Cross went so far as to segregate blood from blood donors, even though there's no scientific basis to do that. And so the military just as easily could have desegregated in 1938, except for the racial prejudice that was rampant in the military and across the country. But it's still important that they do it in 1948 because that's before the Brown versus Board decision. It's before most of corporate America or higher education becomes desegregated. And so that's what's so welcome among Black Americans, that they've been pushing for this, they've been fighting for it for more than a decade. And Truman recognizes that pressure. That's one of the things that finally tips him over. And he's really weighing what he's going to gain and what he's going to lose. He recognizes he's going to gain Black votes, and he does. It's one of the things that helps to secure the Black vote for the Democratic Party for the next several generations. But he also recognizes he's going to lose votes. He's going to lose the white Southerners who had been a cornerstone of the Democratic Party. And that comes true as well. It's what leads to, in part, to the fracturing of the Democratic Party. The Dixiecrats break off, in part because they're frustrated by this desegregation. They see it as an affront to what they consider the proper racial order.
Thank you. One of our attendees mentions, thank you for the incredible discussion. Looking forward to reading the book. Also love your bookshelf. We always appreciate a nice display of books here. Do you have a sense of how many of the Black troops or Black service members overall were descendants of the African diaspora outside of African America, if you know what I mean? Or are there particular people who were, say, of a Jamaican background or a Caribbean background?
That's a great question. So I don't have percentages, but there absolutely were, both in every aspect of the story. In the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, some of those volunteers were from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican. Within the Tuskegee Airmen, there was a Afro-Latino pilot from the Dominican Republic, and there were certainly other Caribbean soldiers. Can't give a precise percentage, but this was recognized at the time, that there had been waves of immigration from the Caribbean and from Africa even in the early part of the 20th century into places like New York, Chicago, and that they populated these Black units once they came into the military.
Thank you. So I was curious about the experience of Black American soldiers who are deployed in the UK prior to D-Day. My impression is that often their experiences were, more positive than walking down the streets at home, but that there were also some significant problems and kind of odd reactions. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really important part of the story. So by and large, Black troops, when they deployed to Europe in the UK or in France, were treated much better than they were treated in the United States. This is how they described it. Medgar Evers, for example, said that his time with a white family in France was the first time he felt like he was ever treated as a full human being. It was 180 degrees different than how he was treated by white Mississippians. It really opened his eyes to what was possible. The same was true in the UK. Part of what they appreciated was just the freedom, the ability to eat where they wanted to, drink where they wanted to, dance with whom they wanted to. Part of the problem was once white troops got there, they tried to import American racial segregation into the UK and into France. And that's where a lot of the conflicts emerged. A lot of these white troops, particularly white Southern troops, were really upset about the idea of Black troops being able to drink and eat in these pubs and potentially dance with white British women. Violence ensued. There were open riots in the UK between Black and white troops. And there's one quote I have in the book that one of the military planners said, it's a good thing that the D-Day invasion happened when it did, because things were getting so heated between Black and white troops, he feared an even larger race riot would happen. So it was important to actually get the troops out of there because things got so fraught. I think it's a good example of just how deeply rooted a lot of this prejudice was, that it wasn't enough. There wasn't a sense of unity. I think we'd like to look back at World War II and think either on the home front or within the fighting forces, there was a sense of unity and a sense of purpose that brought people together. And there were unfortunately too many examples of people's racial prejudice blinding them to what should have been the larger military objectives.
Thank you. So good question in the chat. Recently in the news, there was a Black Vietnam War veteran who was finally awarded a Medal of Honor decades after the submissions were, quote, lost. So has that kind of injustice continued, albeit more attenuated, or is that a lone example?
That was a really interesting story. One of the things that happens between World War II and the Vietnam War is the military really takes pride in the fact that it's among the most integrated institutions in the country. And so whereas Black troops didn't receive the Medal of Honor during World War II, there were dozens who received the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. Particularly in the start of the war, Black troops are overrepresented in combat. But still, racism was always an undercurrent. There was still, even despite the demographic numbers, even despite the marketing that the military did, racism was still always there. And so I think the story that just came out, I think, is a good example of how paperwork could get quote unquote lost, though likely it was racism that played some role in it. And so I'd say overall, the racism declined in some ways between World War II and Vietnam, but it was still an omnipresent part of the day-to-day life of Black troops.
Well, unfortunately, makes sense that would be the case. Thank you. I was also thinking a little bit, can you talk a little about the racism or the sort of racialized experience experienced by Black Americans in the armed forces in comparison with the experience of Japanese Americans, like the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think, as everyone on the call knows, Japanese Americans were, at least on the mainland, were interned during the war. And so their experience was entirely unique. I think there are parallels in terms of the that both groups experienced racism, but it's important to recognize the different forms of racism that took the uprooting of these Japanese Americans, uprooting of their communities, the loss of property and land and memories and community structure that went along with that was had a lasting traumatic impact on Japanese American communities. In terms of military service, I think the fact that the 442nd was drafted to serve while families were in internment camps, I think is a powerful parallel to the Double Victory campaign, because it was an experience that was not identical, but it certainly rhymed with the Black American experience, trying to demonstrate patriotism, demonstrate bravery, with the hope that by demonstrating one's prowess in military service, by demonstrating this patriotism, that full citizenship will be obtained. And of course, the 442nd was a highly decorated unit. And so I think when we think about the period of World War II, these stories help us reckon with the reality of the war, that we need to give credit to that generation of veterans, but we also need to be honest about the racism that was part of the experience of both the veterans themselves, but also their families back on the home front.
Yeah, thank you. I also think of the Navajo cloud talkers who similarly were experiencing a huge amount of prejudice, and I think, I mean, prejudice had their culture, actively suppressed, obviously. And I tend to think, though I may be mistaken, somebody please jump in if you're more knowledgeable than I am, that the cloud talkers in particular tend to be portrayed as kind of nobly rising above all of this, that their culture had been suppressed all this time, but now they're heroically using it in defense of this country that had excluded them. I mean, is that kind of portrayal of all of these groups useful, or does it kind of put people on a pedestal?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is a real double-edged sword to centering this history. I think it's even something I was trying to be cognizant of in this book, that I want to do justice to these Black veterans, but I also want to make it clear that, maybe the way I put it is they understood patriotism and dissent to go hand in hand. So I think it's important not to fall in the trap of elevating people and only thinking that they were uncritically patriotic. Because I think the Vernon Baker quote, I think, is a great example. Like, these men and women were angry, right? They recognized the hypocrisy, and yet they were committed to helping win the war. They're committed to making America a better country. I think that's what's so inspiring. I think it's why it's an important story to tell today. I think there's sometimes in our political climate where it seems like patriotism and dissent are on opposite ends of a spectrum that can't be reconciled. That's never been true for Black Americans, and it certainly wasn't true for this generation of Black veterans. Part of their patriotism was rooted in dissent. They wanted America to be a country that was worth fighting for.
Yeah, that's I think very profound, and I appreciate it. It also seems to me that it's especially relevant to point out that some of these are individual people that we think of as heroes in the greater sense, and many of them are heroes, but are also regular people, as you repeatedly mentioned, that it doesn't take a unique sort of person, or maybe many people are unique sort of, to be able to participate and to do good on both victory fronts. So yeah, good. So I think we'll move towards wrapping up. Folks in the audience, if there's anything else you'd like to add, please drop it in the chat now. I might just toss in one more question, if you don't mind. I was just especially struck by the quote from the soldier's letter about the small town dictating policy to the federal government. Sort of great, unsurprising irony, but and it makes me think of the way that in our contemporary world, textbooks and educational policy get dictated by larger states, Texas, Florida. Is that a useful parallel, that phenomenon of giving too much respect to the rights of the wrong minority, or a minority who isn't doing anything more to deserve that much respect?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting parallel to draw. I think in terms of who determines which stories we choose to tell about the past, or which histories we honor. I mean, in the context of World War II, it was a real point of frustration that Black Americans recognized if the federal government wanted to make a change, they had the power to do so. Right? Part of what the military is supposed to be able to do is dictate policy. They dictated all sorts of policies, except they refused to dictate the basic human rights and dignity for Black Americans. I think in the educational space, it is is worrisome if certain groups or certain states would dictate certain views on how we can and should teach history. That hopefully our obligation as citizens is to reckon honestly with the shared history of our country.
Thank you so much. Seeing some great comments and thanks in the chat. Is there anything else that hasn't been mentioned that you'd like to add?
I know I really appreciate the questions and appreciate taking time this evening. And it's always fun to talk about this issue. I appreciate everyone tuning out tonight.